Welcome in, everyone. Ready to give those brains a workout.
Sound like a plan.
Today's deep dive is all about critical thinking, and we're using Tyler Andrew Cole's Critical Thinking Mastery as our guide.
Excellent choice. That book's a gem.
Right, like we all know critical thinking is important, but what I love about Cole is how he breaks it down.
He really does. And in that first chapter, he just cuts right to the chase and says, forget this idea that it's some kind of like innate talent.
Yeah, like some people are just born knowing how to win arguments and see through BS.
Right. But it's not like that at all. He's like, it's a skill. It's a toolbox. Anyone can build it.
Okay, phew, that's a relief. This is starting to feel a little inadequate there for a second.
Oh, exactly. And he even compares it to, like building a muscle.
Oh, I like that.
Which I think is such a good analogy. You're not going to walk into the gym for the first time and like deadlift a car.
Yeah, definitely not happening.
Before we go on with the podcast, I invite you to download the free bundle, which contains the ebook and an executive summary of all the chapters with the key takeaways. Click on the first link in the description to claim your free bundle now and maximize your learning potential. Now it's free, but it won't be for long, so make sure to grab it while you can.
You start with the smaller weights, you practice consistently.
Yeah.
Same with critical thinking.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
And just like, getting stronger physically can make you feel more confident. Stronger critical thinking can equip you for better decisions.
Absolutely.
Fewer of those arguments based on like faulty logic and all that.
Oh, I could use some of that for sure.
Right.
And I think that's something that our listeners are really like craving. It's not just about, acing a philosophy exam. It's about actually navigating like everyday life with more awareness.
100%. And that's where like chapter 2 gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because he talks about the mind being this like uncharted territory. And this isn't like some abstract concept either.
Okay.
He offers really practical tools, things like mindfulness and journaling.
Love it. Practical.
To increase self-awareness.
Okay. So instead of just feeling lost in our own thoughts all the time, we can actually use these techniques to like map out the terrain of our own minds.
Precisely. Because once you start paying attention, you start to realize how often we fall into these thinking traps.
Oh, yeah.
These cognitive biases that he dives into in chapter 4.
Uh-oh.
It's fascinating stuff. He talks about how like our brains, they love to take shortcuts.
Oh, I can relate to that. Shortcuts, yes, please.
Right. But sometimes those shortcuts lead us straight into a ditch.
Okay, yeah, I was just thinking that. So give us an example. What's one of these sneaky biases that we should be like on the lookout for?
Well, confirmation bias is a big one.
Okay.
Have you ever noticed how when you believe something strongly, you tend to like seek out information that confirms your existing belief?
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that. It's like we're building a case for what we already believe. Not really, like being open to other possibilities.
Exactly. And this isn't just some harmless quirk either.
Uh-oh.
This can lead us to make like bad decisions, cling to false beliefs.
Right.
It can even damage relationships. Imagine if you only ever listened to friends who agreed with you all the time.
Yeah, that would get really boring after a while, wouldn't it?
Right.
Okay, so how do we combat this? Because let's be real, none of us are immune to a good dose of confirmation bias. So what's the antidote?
Well, he talks about the importance of actively seeking out diverse viewpoints.
Okay.
Even if, and this is crucial, even if those viewpoints make us uncomfortable.
Which, honestly, sometimes it does a little bit,
No, absolutely. But that's where the real learning and growth happens.
Totally. So it's not about being right all the time.
Not at all.
It's about being open to the idea that maybe, just maybe, we don't have the whole picture.
Exactly. And that's where like true learning and growth happen. By exposing ourselves to those different perspectives, we can like challenge our own assumptions, potentially expand our understanding of the world.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's like expanding the like data points that we're using to make decisions and form opinions and all of that. Okay, so we've mapped out the terrain of our minds. We've identified some of these sneaky biases.
Before we continue, I want to remind you that you can always find the free audiobook version of this book on the main Grow to the Top channel. Click on the second link in the description to start listening now.
What's next on this cognitive adventure?
Well, now that we're aware of these like unconscious biases, let's give ourselves the tools to challenge them.
Okay.
And that's where chapter 3 comes in, where he dives into logic.
Right.
And he talks about logical reasoning as being like a key component of critical thinking.
So less emotional reasoning, more like Spock-like logic.
Precisely.
I can get behind that.
And it's not about becoming robots, right?
Right.
But learning how to construct sound arguments, identify flaws in reasoning.
Okay.
Basically, think more clearly.
I like it. Give us a taste. What was one of those like aha moments from chapter 3 that really like shifted your thinking?
You know, it's funny because we've all been in those arguments where you can just tell the other person's logic is flawed, right?
Yeah.
But you can't quite put your finger on why.
Yes, all the time.
And Cole actually breaks down these logical fallacies, these common errors in reasoning that can like make an argument fall apart.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It's like having a name for that feeling. Like when you're buying a used car and they tell you it has a perfect engine, you're like, I don't know about that. I need some more proof.
Exactly. And one fallacy that he unpacks that I think is so relevant is the straw man.
Okay.
Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, vaguely.
Basically, it's when someone misrepresents their opponent's argument to make it easier to attack.
Oh, so they kind of twist your words.
Exactly. Instead of actually engaging with the points that you're making, they build up this like flimsy, distorted version of your argument.
Yeah.
And then they tear that down instead.
Oh, that's so frustrating.
Right. So imagine, for example, you're like debating the merits of a plant-based diet.
Okay.
And someone says, oh, so you want everyone to starve because they can't afford fancy vegetables.
Right. Like that's not what I'm saying at all.
Exactly. They've completely twisted your argument into something that it's not.
Yeah. Classic straw man right there.
Exactly.
Okay. So we're on to their tricks now.
Right.
But knowing about the fallacies isn't enough.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
We have to be able to actually use that knowledge.
100%.
Like apply it.
And he gives strategies for that too.
Okay, good.
Like, it's one thing to be able to spot the fallacy, but, you know, he talks about the importance of like calmly pointing it out.
Right.
Ideally with like evidence to support your own counter argument.
Ooh, evidence. I like it.
Right.
Yeah, that can come in handy, not just for like, structured debates, but just like everyday conversations.
Oh, yeah.
Online, all that stuff.
All the time.
Okay, so we're getting pretty good at like building arguments, spotting the bad ones. What else should we add to our like critical thinking toolkit?
Well, logic is a great foundation, but he really emphasizes that it's only one part of the equation.
Okay.
We need to be anchoring those arguments in solid evidence.
Oh, okay.
Chapter 3 really drives this point home, the importance of evidence-based thinking.
Yeah, it's like that saying, trust but verify, right? Especially in the age of misinformation. You can't just accept things at face value. You have to ask yourself, well, what's the source of this information? Is it credible?
Exactly. And if someone makes a claim, don't be afraid to like ask for evidence.
Yeah.
Is there research to support this? Are there like credible experts who agree?
Right.
Don't be afraid to like dig a little deeper.
I love that.
Yeah.
Healthy skepticism, a critical thinking superpower.
Yes.
All right, so now that we're armed with logic, evidence, and a discerning eye, let's talk about how we can tackle some of those like big, hairy problems that we all face in life. What does Cole have to say about problem solving in chapter 5?
This is where things get really practical, I think, in the book. He uses this great analogy of a tangled knot. You know how when you're faced with this huge, tangled mess, it can just feel so overwhelming.
Yes. My brain goes into shutdown mode.
Yeah.
Like I can't.
Exactly. And that's exactly the point, right?
Yeah.
Instead of like panicking about this whole mess, he says, we need to break it down.
Okay.
He calls it problem decomposition.
Okay.
And it's basically taking that massive knot and separating it into like smaller, more manageable threads.
Okay. So instead of saying, how do I solve world hunger?
Right.
It's more like, what are the root causes of food insecurity in this specific region?
Exactly.
Suddenly it feels a little less daunting.
Exactly. And once you've like broken down the problem into those smaller parts, then you can start to like brainstorm solutions for each thread. And this is where like creativity comes into play, thinking outside the box, considering different perspectives, all of that.
So it's not just about finding like any solution. It's about finding the best solution.
Exactly.
We're not just throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Exactly. And that's where, again, that critical thinking is so crucial.
Right.
Because he encourages us to, evaluate each potential solution.
Right.
Weigh the pros and cons, anticipate potential pitfalls. It's about making like strategic, well-informed decisions.
Which brings us to chapter 7. where Cole takes this idea of like considering different perspectives to a whole other level.
It's interesting because, so many people talk about tolerance as if it's the ultimate goal, but Cole pushes further.
Okay, I like where this is going.
He says it's not enough to just tolerate diverse viewpoints.
Yeah.
We need to actively seek them out.
Okay, so explain that one to me. Why is it so important to actually go out of our way to find viewpoints that might even contradict our own? Isn't that making things harder on ourselves?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds kind of scary, honestly.
It can be, but think of it this way. If you're only ever exposed to the same ideas, the same perspectives, how can you be sure you're really thinking critically?
Okay, yeah.
It's like only ever eating one type of food. You're missing out on a whole world of flavors and nutrients.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah, diversity of thought, it's like fuel for critical thinking.
Okay.
And by engaging with those different perspectives, even the ones that initially make us a little uncomfortable, we challenge our own biases, we refine our arguments, we potentially arrive at more nuanced and well-rounded conclusions.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's like when you travel to a new place and you experience a completely different culture, it might challenge those assumptions that you have.
Right.
But it also kind of broadens your horizons, helps you see the world in this new light.
Precisely. And this ability to kind of embrace those diverse viewpoints, it's not just some abstract ideal. Cole actually gives really practical tips for how to actually do this in our everyday lives.
Okay, hit us with some actionable advice. How do we seek out those different perspectives?
Well, he suggests things like, deliberately seeking out news sources that challenge your political leanings.
Okay.
Following thought leaders on social media who have different opinions than your own.
Right.
Even just striking up conversations with people from different backgrounds and experiences.
It's about stepping outside of our echo chambers a little bit
100%.
and engaging with the world in all of its complexity.
Exactly. And this leads beautifully into chapter 8, where he talks about decision making.
Okay.
Particularly those high stakes decisions where we often feel that pressure to make the quote unquote right call.
Oh, we've all been there. Frozen by indecision, oh my gosh, what if I make the wrong choice?
What's Cole's wisdom on navigating those pressure cooker moments?
Well, he acknowledges that we rarely have all the information we'd like when making big decisions.
Right.
But instead of getting stuck in that analysis paralysis,
Right.
he encourages us to use tools like scenario planning.
Okay, so instead of trying to predict the future, which is impossible.
Right. We can at least be prepared for those different possibilities.
Right.
So how does that work? How do you scenario plan?
Basically, you identify the possible outcomes of a decision,
Okay.
and then you think through the potential consequences of each outcome. It's kind of like choose your own adventure for your life, but with a more strategic, analytical approach.
Okay, so say I'm trying to decide whether or not to take this new job offer. Instead of just going back and forth in my mind, I could sit down and map out, okay, if I take this new job, what are the best and worst case scenarios? And what about if I stay at my current job?
Exactly. And by playing out those different scenarios, we can anticipate potential challenges,
Right.
identify resources that we might need,
Yeah.
and ultimately just make it a more informed decision.
And hopefully feel more confident in that decision, even if things don't go exactly as planned, which, let's be real, they rarely do, which is why we need that healthy dose of resilience, right? Doesn't Cole talk about that in chapter 9?
He does, and he ties it back beautifully to this idea of a growth mindset.
Okay.
So instead of seeing setbacks as failures,
Yeah.
we can reframe them as opportunities for learning and growth.
Like that whole idea, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Exactly. But in this case, it's not just about surviving.
Right.
It's about using those experiences, even the tough ones, to become more resilient, more adaptable.
Love it. And that kind of ties back to this whole idea of lifelong learning, right?
Yeah.
Cole talks about that in chapters 13 and 14.
He does. He reminds us that critical thinking, it's not a destination.
Okay.
It's an ongoing journey.
We're never done learning, are we? I love that. So it's about staying curious, embracing the unknown, even being willing to change our minds when we get that new information.
100%. And I think that's such an important message, especially as we're wrapping up this deep dive.
Yeah.
Because critical thinking isn't about achieving some kind of perfect objective truth. It's about being willing to ask those tough questions, challenge assumptions,
Yeah.
engage in thoughtful dialogue, even and perhaps especially when it's uncomfortable.
It's about embracing those gray areas, the nuances,
Yes.
recognizing that there's always more to learn.
Beautifully put.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. We covered so much ground, from understanding cognitive biases to mastering logical fallacies to embracing those diverse viewpoints. I feel like we've worked out our brains.
We have.
What a workout.
Yes.
So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, remember what we learned about problem decomposition. Break it down. Start with one small step.
Exactly. Pick one technique that resonated with you from this deep dive and just try incorporating it into your daily life.
Yeah.
You might be surprised at the impact it has on your thinking, your decision-making, even your relationships.
And keep those mental muscles flexed. The more you practice critical thinking, the more natural it's going to become. Until next time, everyone, happy thinking.